only a handful of European countries declared themselves neutral during World War II. Spain was one of them. It was a country whose famous armada was once the most powerful navy in the world, finally beaten by the English navy of Queen Elizabeth I in 1588. By 1939, Spain's army was small by European standards, and the country, like Sweden, Switzerland, and Portugal, chose to remain neutral. So why are we covering a country that was supposedly neutral during World War II? Well, it's because using the word neutral for Spain is an exaggeration, to say the least. Though neutral on paper, Spain was anything but that in reality, including its navy. Let's explore that now. Spain continued to have a proud naval tradition into the 20th century, albeit a much more modest one. It was a minor imperial power compared to Britain and France, but still had illusions of grandeur of a time when its empire was the largest on Earth. However, her fleet had been severely decimated by the bruising defeat it suffered in the American-Spanish War of 1898, which saw Spain lose its colonies in the Caribbean and Central America, as well as Pacific region. The loss of colonies like Cuba and the Philippines was devastating for Spanish pride, from which the country never truly recovered. Interestingly, although huge enemies for many centuries, by the 1900s, Spain and Britain were allies, and the British actively helped Spain rebuild its navy. That would explain how Spain had 2 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, and 8 heavy cruisers by 1939, which were either British-built or designed. Spain had sizable shipbuilding facilities at Ferrol on the country's northeastern Atlantic coast and at Cartagena, located on the Mediterranean near the southeastern city of Murcia. A new shipyard was launched at the southwestern port of Cadiz in the 1920s. It made sense to have Cadiz as a shipyard. It is an ideal location as a gateway between the Atlantic and Mediterranean, making it one of the oldest inhabited cities in Western Europe, dating back to the Phoenicians who used it as a major trading post. But something else had made irreparable damage to the Spanish Navy in the interwar years, and that was the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. The Civil War between the left-wing Republicans and right-wing fascist nationalists was unique in modern naval history. No other war before or since inflicted so much damage to a navy due to fighting between factions within the same country. Not even the American Civil War compares in that regard. Besides its imperial obligations, the Spanish Navy had always had to defend Spanish coastal waters, which is somewhat complex, given the country's Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean and Canary Islands in the Atlantic. The outbreak of civil war on July 17, 1936 immediately complicated everything, since most of the Navy was under Republican control, yet the majority of officers were stridently pro-nationalist. The nationalists seized the naval base at Ferrol very early in the war, and another at Vigo, as well as the battleship España and the cruisers Baleares, Canarias, and Cervera. Fighting within the Navy was fierce, even brutal. For example, 30 pro-nationalist officers were shot and killed by hundreds of sailors loyal to the Republican cause in the port of Ferrol just days after the Civil War broke out. The Republican sailors eventually had to surrender when they ran out of ammunition. What ensued were a series of intense battles between nationalist and Republican naval forces, including a blockade of the Straits of Gibraltar by the Republicans. The nationalists would eventually prevail and win the war, having been backed by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. One cannot analyze the role of Spain in World War II without acknowledging the immense legacy of the Spanish Civil War, which ended on April 1, 1945, only 5 months to the day before Germany invaded Poland. Its navy had to be rebuilt, and importantly, a pro-German fascist government was in power under Generalissimo Franco, who also wanted to remain on the good side of the Allies, and the United States in particular, and so commenced Spanish treachery. Spain decided to keep a number of warships in service, even as the country maintained its neutrality. The size of the Spanish fleet was surprising, given how the recently ended Civil War had involved so much of its navy. It included the aforementioned heavy cruiser, Canarias, 3 Alfonso-class cruisers built back in 1923, 3 Alcedo-class destroyers from 1922, 13 Churruca-class destroyers, 4 Aquila-class destroyers, all of them formerly Italian and transferred to Spain in 1938, and 4 Jupiter-class gunboat mine layers. The fleet also had 2 C-class submarines from 1928 and a Holland-type submarine used for training. Further vessels included a number of gunboats and motor torpedo boats, or MTBs, and 2 Iolo-class mine layers from 1939. It wasn't an especially modern or impressive fleet, but it was enough to warrant concern by the Allies, who were well aware of General Franco's tacit support of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. To be fair, the Spanish never undertook a single offensive naval operation during the entirety of the war. In fact, the country's only active participation with its armed forces was when Franco sent an army contingent, known as the Azul or Blue Division, to fight on the side of the Germans when the USSR was invaded. However, even that single act of sending 20,000 Spanish troops to fight the Soviet Union was a major contravention of any modern laws regarding neutrality. Unsurprisingly, Spain's economy was in ruins in the aftermath of its civil war. General Franco's preference was to turn to its trusted ally, Germany, for assistance in building its economy. The Germans helped where they could, particularly in military aid, but lacked the natural resources needed to fully bolster the Spanish economy. And so Spain turned to the United States and Franklin D. Roosevelt for much-needed aid. The Americans, forever the economic opportunists, agreed to help the Spanish on one condition: Spain could not enter the war on the side of the Axis powers if war broke out. The British in particular were adamant that Spain remained neutral. The reason for this British demand was simple. They feared that a pro-German Spain could hinder British operations in Gibraltar, or worse still, even try and invade the tiny island. The British desperately needed Gibraltar for their naval operations in the Mediterranean, as much as they needed the island of Malta. The Spanish used this leverage to their advantage and promised to abide by this stipulation, and so the Neutrality Act of 1939 was passed by the U.S. Congress, thereby lifting the arms embargo on Spain which had existed during the Spanish Civil War and opening up funds for aid to Spain. The reality, however, was that Spanish neutrality never did really exist. We'll come to that in a moment. Importantly for Spain, the Neutrality Act of 1939 meant that it could secure as much oil as needed from the Caribbean via the U.S. However, it soon became apparent to the Allies that Spain was buying up huge amounts of oil, as much as 3 times more than usual and far more than it needed for its domestic economy and military. Where was all that oil going? The Allies discovered that Spain was surreptitiously selling a lot of the oil to Italy. This was made clear in a telegraph sent on June 14, 1940, by the U.S. Ambassador to France, William C. Bullitt, to the U.S. Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles. In the telegraph, Ambassador Bullitt called attention to 21 oil tankers that were en route to Spain. Most of that oil was to be diverted to Italy, and a significant amount of the diverted fuel would be going to that country's large navy, or Regia Marina. This turn of events was a massive blow to the British in particular, given that Italy was using the Mediterranean as its own trading playground, in particular for naval convoys between Italy and North Africa and along sea lanes via the Suez Canal. Matters got even more complicated on June 12, 1940, when General Franco declared that Spain would no longer be a neutral power, but instead a so-called non-belligerent. It was a clever ploy by Franco, allowing Spain to cozy up to Germany and Italy while still maintaining the pretense of non-involvement to the Allies. Nevertheless, under immense lobbying by Britain, the United States soon canceled all oil sales to Spain. Franco had pledged that Spain would help in any way with Germany's U-boat operations, including their refurbishment when needed. He also allowed Germany's Luftwaffe to have free access to all the country's airfields. As an adjunct to that, Spain allowed German military intelligence to operate freely in Spain, making its capital, Madrid, and a host of other Spanish cities a hive of German intelligence gathering. German naval agents were all over the Spanish southern coast, allowing them to gather invaluable information regarding Allied shipping and naval exercises in the Mediterranean. Like many in Europe, Franco was convinced that Germany was going to win the war. Unlike many other countries, however, Franco was delighted at this prospect, which is why he did so much to aid the Germans as much as possible without getting actively involved. When France fell to Germany in June 1940, the Spanish immediately took the opportunity to invade and seize the all-important port of Tangiers in Morocco on Africa's north coast, which was a French possession at the time. Franco, convinced that Germany would soon win the war, knew what a huge strategic boost to Spain's navy the Moroccan port would be. The Spanish naval fleet was mostly kept up with German assistance, although it remained tiny compared to the might of the German Navy or Reichsmarine. However, it wasn't Spanish ships that Hitler was interested in. Oh no, it was something far more important to the Germans. Its name was Gibraltar. In terms of strategic importance, one cannot underestimate how critical the small rocky outcrop at the entrance to the Mediterranean was for German naval aspirations, and General Franco milked that for all it's worth. Documents released by Britain's National Archives in March 2005 provide fascinating insights into the role Spain played on behalf of Germany regarding Gibraltar. The intelligence was by Britain's Defense Security Office, or DSO, based in Gibraltar during the war, with most of the report compiled by David Scher, a Spanish-speaking British agent who headed the DSO's Security Intelligence Department. Spying by the Spanish and Germans on one side and British on the other was rife, and Scher was at the center of it all, like something out of a spy novel. The British knew that the Spanish intelligence service was working in close contact with its German counterpart, the Abwehr. The British also knew too well that the Germans wanted to get their hands on Gibraltar's naval dockyard and airfield. The Abwehr not only had a large surveillance station in Spain's capital, Madrid, but also at locations in Spanish-occupied Tangiers and other parts of Spanish-occupied North Africa. Most Spanish agents were fanatically anti-British, including being resentful of Britain's control of Gibraltar, which the British had seized in 1708. However, the DSO was able to count on a number of anti-Franco Spanish double agents, men who had been Republicans during the Civil War and were fervently anti-fascist. The British needed everything they could because Gibraltar, or the Rock as they liked to nickname it, was under constant attack by German and Spanish sabotage. Some of the attacks on British installations on Gibraltar were serious, usually undertaken by Spanish agents trained by the Germans. Two of these Spanish agents were Luis López Cordón Cuenca and José Martín Muñoz, both of whom were caught in 1943. Both men had conspired to set fire or blow up the dockyard at Gibraltar. Both men were hanged on January 11, 1944. That deed was done by the veteran British hangman Albert Pierrepoint, who had to travel undercover to Gibraltar in order to carry out the executions. Importantly, Gibraltar was home to Force H, under the command of Vice Admiral Somerville, which had to provide escort for the Allied convoys needed to help the beleaguered island of Malta. The importance of Gibraltar only grew in stature when General Dwight Eisenhower set up his headquarters on the island in November 1942. He wanted it as the base for Operation Torch, which was the plan to capture French North Africa and rid that region of the Germans and Italians. Fortunately for the British, they were able to have much success with the use of double agents. The British were masters of this technique, often capturing foreign spies and forcing them to become double agents. This double-cross technique, so quintessentially British at the time, was so successful that neither the Germans nor Spanish were able to undertake a single act of land-based sabotage against the British on Gibraltar after July 1943. In fact, no less than 43 planned sabotage attacks against the British were thwarted due to the use of double agents. Even so, there were successful seaborne attacks against the British in and around Gibraltar, particularly by Italian frogmen who were the best in the world. In the end, it didn't matter. The Germans would eventually be run out of North Africa and thereafter lose the war in Europe. Franco had backed the wrong horse. Even so, there were no consequences for Spain. Its thin veil of neutrality kept it from the post-war wrath of the Allies, and Franco maintained power until his death in 1975. However, the Second World War is filled with ifs in which, had things just gone slightly differently, the outcome may have been quite different. And one of the biggest ifs of all was what might have happened had the Germans, with the aid of Spain, been able to capture Gibraltar. History is filled with ifs such as those.